Welcome to episode 13 of Regulate Tech with me, Nicklas, Berild, Lundblad, and
with me, Richard Allan.
There we go. And since it's episode 13, we have to state that it's complete coincidence that we're going to talk about taxes. And we're not going to touch on death at all, even though death and taxes are the only certain things in this world. So tax is a fascinating subject in many ways. There are those who are lured into thinking that it's technical or boring, but tax is ultimately, at the heart of it, an ethical question, isn't it? I mean, why do we pay tax? Yeah. If you were just to boil it down to the simplest fact, why do we pay tax?
I mean, I think it's very symbolic of whether or not you're making a contribution to society as a whole, as opposed to simply looking after your own. And so it's really interesting, actually, in the corporate tax world, the focus is very much on corporate income tax. And so there's a whole range of different taxes that people pay, businesses and individuals. We pay, sales taxes on stuff we buy. Corporations will raise sales tax, or they'll generate sales tax by their activity. They'll pay taxes to local authorities for their premises and things. But at the heart of it is there's this idea of, if you've made money, if you've been lucky or worked hard or been lucky, diligent, and made some money, yes, then a certain percentage of the money that you make, whether you're an individual or a corporation, should go into this big central pot, government, in order then to pay for services. And of course, across the political divide, there are different views, and this is a classic left-right issue. I think, broadly speaking, those at the left end of the spectrum would say, the more that you pay into that central pot, the happier and better off society will be. And those at the right may say, well, some taxation is okay, but they worry that government will waste the money that's put into the centre. So there's definitely a divide. But broadly speaking, I think most people, whichever political background they come from, will say, look, if you've made money, then it's fair and reasonable that those who have made more money should make a greater contribution to the public pot that will pay for the things that we all need than those who have made less money. And that's really where people focus.
And I think we need to tease something out here. We'll stay in Europe for a while and discuss the European conception of tax, and then contrast that a bit with the US, I think. But there is something here also, not just about the sum of the money. So if you say that you make a lot of money and you owe 100 million in taxes, it's not okay for you to then say, I will use these 100 million and I will build 2 schools for them. Because there is something here about the subjugation of the corporation under the authority of the collective state. There is something about power here too, isn't there?
That's right. There's a difference between sort of charity and tax. And in a sense, and I think you're right, this may be one of the dividing lines to a certain extent between Europe and the US, that in Europe, there's a very strong sense that charity is good, but it's not in any way a substitute for paying into the central pot, where the way in which the money is spent is then decided by democratically elected politicians who may have an agenda that you disagree with. So you can't just fund the stuff you like. You put the money in the pot, and then the country as a whole decides how that money gets spent. Charity, on the other hand, again, very good, potentially very socially beneficial, but there's still a sense that that's really you deciding how you want to spend the money. You decide whether you're going to give it to schools or hospitals or whatever it is that you would favour as a individual or as a company. And yes, that's a good thing, but it is not a substitute for paying into a central pot and then having government decide where that money should go, whether or not you as an individual, think that's a good thing or not. And I think in the US, actually, by contrast, there is a much stronger sense, and this is reflected in the US tax system, where I think there are there's a lot more scope for people to I won't use the word avoid, but not be as liable for taxes if they give money away. So there's more opportunity for you to endow a museum, and we've been to the US a lot, and you get these sort of massive array of odd little museums and things across the United States. And in part, that's because I think they do have a much stronger sense of saying, look, in some senses, charitable giving is more of a substitute for taxation, whereas in Europe, yes, we like the charitable giving, but we don't incentivize it, I think, to the same degree.
I think that's right, and I think that in Europe it's much more about the control over the money than the actual sum of the money, the ability to collectively spend it in a way that's, as you say, democratically legitimate, and not seizing that prerogative to a single individual who then gets to decide how the money is spent. And it's an interesting difference because, and I think it's often missed in translation when we discuss this with. At least I found this a couple of times when you discuss it with American colleagues, because for them, the contributions, not just the contributions that you would make charitably, but the contributions to the economy overall, where you would grow it, where you would be sort of a net benefit for an economy, would themselves be evidence that you're really paying your fair share back. But that didn't count for much with most of the sort of stakeholders that you would meet in Europe. They would be much more interested in having the ability to control that money and to sort of having the ability to spend it in a way that they felt was the right way to spend it. Now, this brings us to a sort of interesting position. Tax is easy if you're just taxing the people in your country, and you're just taxing within your borders, and you don't have to care about where anyone is. Then taxes seems somewhat simplistic. But if you suddenly have an international globalized world, what is the first thing you run into in terms of a problem when you want to build a tax system that reflects that not everyone is within the borders of a single country?
Yeah, so I think the critical decision is, where is the value being created that you are taxing? And you're absolutely right. So if I'm sitting in the UK and I come up with a brilliant idea for a widget, some kind of object that's useful, and I can make my widget for £100 and I can sell it for £200, that's £100 worth of profit that has come from my genius that is now eligible for taxation by the British government. And as long as that activity is all in the UK, it's really simple. But when I start selling my widget abroad in other countries, actually the basic logic of the taxation system is that £100 should still be coming back to Britain to be taxed by the British government. The fact that someone's bought it in France or Germany is kind of neither here nor there. The genius, the economic value that made all of that profit was the value of my activity in the United Kingdom. But of course, that starts to become very unsatisfactory for other governments. Once, I'm selling enough widgets and potentially displacing the widget makers in their market, they start to look at this and go, well, hang on a minute. All the profit is flowing back to the United Kingdom. I'm not able to tax it. And I think that's sort of where we get to with a lot of these debates, is to say, where is the economic value being created? And fair taxation means that the government in the country where the value is being created should get to tax those profits. And when it's an international transaction, I say some levels it may be, pretty straightforward. It's still, I've built something, I'm in Britain, Britain still gets the taxes for the stuff I've built. But increasingly, and we'll get into this now as we start looking at the tech sector, there's an argument to say, well, actually, no, some of the genius was British genius and the British government gets to tax that. But some of the genius was marketing genius in France, or distribution genius in Germany, or some other kind of, economic value add. And therefore, instead of all of that £100 of profit being taxed in the UK, we should slice it up. And the UK will get some, but now the other countries want a slice of it as well. And then the critical question is, what's the formula by which you divide up that economic value, that pie, so that everybody feels it's fair?
Let's also, before we sort of go into the nuance, sketch out the two versions. You've talked about one of them, which I think is the value creation theory, where you tax a company where the value is created, and arguably the value is created where the company is headquartered, where it has its the majority of the people working for it, et cetera, et cetera. But then the other model that you referred to and sort of sketched out is one that's solely based on where the value is consumed, right?
Yes.
The idea being that, if you are a small Finnish company and you have created an app with exploding birds, I think that would be a weird thing. And a lot of the people who buy this app or look at advertising in it are in France. Then that's where the value, according to that theory, is being consumed. And so the consumption should be the basis of taxation, not the creation, in a sense. And so you have these two opposite images. Before we sort of dive into the nuance, it's interesting, I think, to think about what these models reward. Because in the first case, if I was the Finnish government and was arguing for the value creation model, where I said the value is created in Finland, I would say, look, we have some of the best schools in the world, according to the PISA investigations. We invest tons in startup ecosystems. We have incubators, accelerators, you name it. We have all of these different innovation system components that we have designed carefully over the decades that have passed by. And so the value that's created by this company that has written a game with exploding birds is the collective product of the Finnish society's political prioritizations and political choices. It's just legitimate that money should come back to us in Finland and not just be sent away to where it's consumed. Because the only thing you reward with the consumption model, it seems to me, and I'd like to hear if you think that's right, is demographics. A lot of people.
Yeah, demographics and money. So you're right. You just made a very compelling case, I think, for Finland to retain the tax revenue from that exploding bird game. I mean, in a sense, sort of traditionally, we've ended up, we have both getting taxed. So we have sales taxes. So, all of that economic activity is tax. And again, this is sometimes lost in the debate, but even with the digital companies, when they're selling their advertising products in other countries, if other countries have a sales tax, they're bringing in the revenues. They may be getting 10 or 20% of all of the value of that digital advertising may be flowing in as a sales tax. But corporate income tax, I think in particular, and this is where it's important to tease them out, but corporate income tax, I think traditionally was very strongly associated with that sort of genius invention creation part of it. And so it's both and, but I think what's been interesting over recent years is government saying, particularly when it comes to the tech sector, and again, I think as we have this conversation, we can tease out where we think things are peculiar to tech and where they're more generic. But particularly in the context of the tech sector, they're saying, look, sales tax is not enough. I also want a slice of the corporate income tax. I want a slice of the profits that you're making, because and again, people are developing new theories to argue why in the case of a digital company, all of the genius isn't in the originating or the HQ country, that the genius is shared between the HQ country and the consuming country.
There is also, and I think we should recognize that one doesn't have to be a great cynic to point out that value-added tax, for example, or consumption tax hits the electorate, whereas a corporation tax hits a company in another country. So it's easier, in a sense, from a purely political standpoint, to not tax your own citizens, but try to tax instead what is often painted as the big corporate, the industry. And so I think that one reason that value-added tax, sales tax, or consumption tax is not so attractive is that if that was how you were taxing, say, the exploding birds game, you would be making everyone who played that game pay an extra tax, and that would be very visible and possibly not politically entirely easy to pull off. But if you're, on the other hand, strong on big corporations and saying they need to pay their fair share, there's nothing in that has a downside for a politician.
No, I mean, on the face of it, no. And certainly, yes, if it's foreign companies that you're trying to take a slice of revenue out of, and most of the proposals we've seen have been precisely that. In particular, it's been countries outside of the US saying they want a slice of US tech company revenue. Interestingly, none of the governments advocating for that are arguing that their own domestic companies should have to hand over a slice of their corporate income tax to the American government. And there was a sort of row brewing over the last few months where the US government said, I think with some justification, look, if you're going to take a slice of revenue out of our American tech companies, we are going to raise some money from your companies through some other mechanism to compensate for that, because we, the US Treasury, are going to lose money if you make our companies less profitable. Really interesting over the last week, though, we've seen some noises coming out of the new US administration saying, for various reasons, that they do now want to look again and work with all of the major economies through the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. They want to work with other major economies to see if they can come up with some new set of international agreements. And I think that's reflecting the fact that we were risking heading into this sort of tit-for-tat war where governments, thought that it would be okay to try and take a slice of money, free money, from some foreign company, and that this would be at no cost to their own companies. They don't have to give anything up. It's all take, no give. But reality is, in these things, it's going to have to be give and take. There's going to have to be some kind of structure where everybody's treated fairly.
And we have to, and this is the fun thing about tax, that you sort of also have to keep in mind all of the different technicalities, because as we talk about the value creation theory, where you're taxed where the value is created, and we talk about what we can call let's call it the revenue model, where the revenue is generated. So if the revenue is generated in France, you have to pay your taxes where the revenue is, not where the value is created. So value versus revenue. Then we end up in another interesting and very important distinction that a lot of people tend to miss, and that is between profit and revenue,
yes.
Right? Because if you pay tax, you don't regularly in the old system, we wouldn't say that, oh, you made a widget for £100 and you sold it for £200, but then you bought a machine. That means that you essentially lost money this year. So you have an overall loss of £200. We wouldn't tax you for the 100 you made on each widget, but we would say, you didn't actually have a profit, so you don't have to pay any tax. But in the new model, the revenue generated model, would just look at the revenue per widget and say that you need to pay tax per widget, per profit you made there, and we'll isolate that and talk about revenues. So explain to us, how does profit and revenue relate, and what is the right thing to tax, do you think?
I mean, this is one of the areas where I think tech is different. So again, a lot of the tax structures that have caused sort of, I would say, damage to the reputation of the tech sector. We've both been there, and we know how damaging this can be. I mean, some of this is because people scrutinize the tech sector in a way that others are not scrutinized, which should be entirely candid. And again, that's not an excuse for it, but it's just there is a spotlight and a level of scrutiny of large tech companies that I think is quite exceptional. And so there are many kind of tax structures that have been used by other sectors for many, many years that are very similar and have not had the same attention. But people have focused on tech. Now, within that, some things are different. And I think one of the things that are different is just what you put your finger on, Nicklas, which is a classic sort of tech business model is to run at a loss while you're in your growth phase in the hope of future profits. And so I think it would be exceptional, to take that example. I mean, you can look at companies in the transport sector would be one example where, they are spending £100 to build the widget and they're selling it for 90. And they're willing to sell, losing £10 on every widget for 3, 4, 5 years based on money they're getting from their investors, in the hope that further down the track, they're going to start to become profitable. And that's very typical in the tech sector. I think more so than in other sectors. Other sectors do invest up front, but I think that there are very few other kinds of company that are willing to take the pain. And I think we talked about this before in startup land of people saying, what's your burn rate? In other words, how much of your investors' money are you losing? And so, this is unusual. It's a gamble in a sense by those investors. They're hoping that they'll be profitable down the track. Sometimes they will be, sometimes they won't. Now, from a government point of view, this is really challenging. So you think about the transport sector. You have a local taxi scene where, people are running taxis, they're making some profit, they're paying their taxes on the profits they make, you're getting a steady income. Company comes in, starts to run taxi services at a loss. Well, they're not going to pay you any tax. They don't owe you any tax. In fact, they're going to earn tax credits for the losses they make that they will cash in once they start to become profitable. So from a punter's point of view, things may look very good. You're now getting a cheap taxi service funded in part by these foolish investors who are willing to cover the cost of part of your taxi ride. From a government point of view, suddenly you've gone from this sector being a net income to potentially being a loss maker from the government point of view, because you've now got loss-making companies. And I think that happens, we see that sort of happening quite often. That is part of the tech disruption. Someone comes in with very, very low margins and replaces something that was previously high margin. We can again look at it in the retail sector. Somebody comes in willing to do online sales at tiny profit margins or no profit margin because they're doing loss leaders, and they're displacing activity that was in a profitable retail sector previously. So this is something which I think is different and causes governments to be very concerned about tech businesses. And it's precisely because of this, I think entirely sort of correct notion that you tax a business when it's profitable. And that's the way you encourage entrepreneurship. If you start taxing businesses when they're making a loss, you're basically saying to the investors in the example I gave of, well, you're already making a loss subsidizing our taxi rides. Now we'd also like you to give a slice of your money to the government. Doesn't feel like a great incentive for people to try and develop new products and services. So that's always been the notion.
Essentially no economic change if you're completely adverse to any kind of tax structure change risk. Now, there are two things here. One is a very simple sort of public service announcement, and that is whenever you see a company arguing for higher tax rates, check if they're making a profit. That's sort of just the first thing you should do. Any company that argues for raising tax rates is arguably going to have to think about how that would impact on their profit. And if they have none, or if they're loss leaders, as you say, that's an easy political give, in a sense. And I think the other thing that's interesting here is that this only works if the long-term plan for, say, the transport sector is to be profitable. And there we hit the snag again, because where is that profit going to be taxed? Is it going to be taxed where the transportation is actually happening, or is it going to be taxed where the brilliant software systems that help you coordinate across drivers and people who want to travel are made? And at that point, you get an additional problem. Not only are you taking a steady tax income base from a country, you are disrupting it. And then when it starts to become profitable again, the profits are essentially not going to stay in the country where they were in the beginning. And then we get something that has sometimes been referred to as BEPS.
Yes.
That's a fun acronym. Do you want to walk us through what BEPS is?
So it's this base erosion of base profit. So it's basically saying that the tax base has been eroded in different countries because they have a smaller base of economic activity. Because just as you describe, some of that economic activity is now being associated with other countries, or indeed. The profit has sort of gone somewhere completely offshore from anywhere and now can't be taxed by anybody. And it is interesting that I think there are sort of two key elements to trying to unpick this. And again, the Biden administration announcement really zeroes in on one of those. So the first is differentials in taxation rates. And so again, let's use the sort of like human example, because a lot of these things apply to individuals as well. I live in the UK. If I went to do some work in France and I was offered a choice, you can pay the tax on the work you've done in France or in the UK. If the tax rates are the same in both countries, I'll kind of say, well, I don't care. It's fine, like whichever. If there's a huge difference in the tax rates between the two countries, then I'm going to try and find ways, naturally, unless I'm a completely saintly human being, legal ways, again, be very clear. I'm going to try and say, well, legally, I want to have as much of the income in the lowest tax rate country that I can have. And that's sort of what companies have done at a large scale. So they've looked at it, and there was a very particular distortion in that the United States, again, so contrary to many people's perceptions of the United States as this business-friendly country, had a very high rate of corporate income tax. So it's like 35%. For domestic,
and just for you to understand how high that is, that's actually higher than Sweden. So
yes.
I just wanted to
that's high. And a lot of other countries were bobbling around at the sort of 20% rate, but it was 35%. But for your domestic activity, you often had a lot of things you could credit against the tax. So that 35% was notional. But if you look at the companies that are in the sort of list of the top US companies, you see that many massive companies with huge revenues are actually paying a lot less. But if you were making money around the rest of the world as a US company, and you brought the money back to the US, you would expect to pay 35% tax on it. Now, if somebody came along, an accountant, and said, again, entirely legally, I want to be really clear, I don't think anyone's done anything necessarily illegal here. They've said, you can create a structure where we'll keep the profit out of the US, and you won't have to pay that 35%. It's slightly less useful to you because it's sitting somewhere in a bank account somewhere where you can't necessarily sort of deploy it in the way you'd want to, but it's your money, it's on the books. And a lot of the tech company structures that people have been very concerned about were built entirely on that basis, that there was this huge gap between the 35% you would pay if you brought the money back to the US and rates that you could pay elsewhere in the world. And what the Biden administration is suggesting is to equalize that.
Just before we go on to the Biden, I think there are two things about this that strike me as very important. One is your point about legality, that these are legal structures, and I think that we should get back to that question, because there is the question of what's legal and what's morally defensible when it comes to tax, and it's especially I think infected in the tax discourse, and that's something that I want us to sort of get back to. The other thing is that the money was not put in. Take an example at random. Bermuda, a sunny place for shady people, as someone said.
Yes.
It was not put in offshore in a place like that, and then not taxed. But the tax was deferred, which means that at some point you would have to move it back and you would have to tax it. But it was a bet on tax rates going down. That was essentially what sort of underpinned a lot of that model. So it wasn't in the sense that a lot of people say that you're evading tax. What you're evading is present tax, but you know that at some point you're going to have to pay tax on that money when it's repatriated to, for example, the US. So there's something there about the nuance that also gets lost a lot of time, where we tend to think that, if you offshore, you don't have to pay tax at all. But that's not exactly it, is it?
No, it was a bet, and it turned out to be a correct bet, at least from the company's point of view, that yes, they were parking the money in a sense offshore, again, legally. And just to sort of flesh out that example, my widget company, I'm selling my widgets that I've made for £100 for £200 around the world. Now, somebody comes along and says, look, I've got a structure where either you can keep bringing in that profit from abroad and tax it here, or you can sell for £1 million the right to make widgets internationally to this company, which will be in somewhere like the Bermuda or Cayman Islands, wherever it's going to be. And that company now sells your widgets around the world. The money doesn't come back to the UK and is therefore not taxable in the UK. It's sitting somewhere offshore. But you're right, at the point at which you did decide to bring the money back from Widgets International to local widget company, at that point you're liable for tax. And that's pretty much what happened with a lot of the tech companies, that the Donald Trump administration dramatically reduced the tax rate down from that 35%. And in fact, for repatriated international profits, it dropped it even further than the headline tax rate. So that hugely incentivized companies to say, look, we're going to get all this money that we've been holding offshore. We're going to bring it to the US. We're going to pay US taxes at a much more favorable rate than the earlier rate. But they are paid, and now that profit is usable. It sits in the company's coffers. It's all tax paid. It's all legit and reputable. But they were holding that money offshore, and there are some disputes now around, when companies created these structures, did they value the license to do the offshore business accurately enough? And of course, that's something that the US administration can contest if they think that's undervalued, because when the companies sell the license, they're liable for tax in the US. And that's something I know that's being debated in the US end of things. And again, we still have, though, this other element, which is the non-US countries who feel that this arrangement should never have been allowed because this arrangement meant that they were deprived of tax revenue.
But they never were, though, because this was future U.S. tax revenue. So the U.S. could say legitimately that they were being bereaved of tax revenue today, but they would at some future point get it. But I think, I think that you can legitimately argue that there shouldn't be a deferral option like this in the tax system. That is a politically viable opinion, and certainly one that's you can imagine how to construct the the legal ramifications for it, saying that no, you are not going to be able to make bets like this where you think that tax rates will go down in the future. But nobody has done that. And that's the other point that sort of comes back to your legality point, I think, that these bets were made possible by the legal system such as it was designed. And I think there is and maybe this is a good point to come back to the point about legal tax structures and moral tax structures. Because there are a lot of really good, fantastic, I would argue, tax lawyers who understand this enormous complex legal matter and have constructed some validated by tax authorities models that are out there that are quite complex and reflect the complexity sometimes of the underlying organization. But we're increasingly seeing tension between it's legal and it's moral. How do you think that will dissolve?
Yeah, again, I think the instinctive view is, well, the moral choice would be to pay taxes in the country in which one sits. So from a British perspective, the moral choice is for companies to be paying taxes in Britain, and from a French perspective, it's for them to be paying taxes in France. From a US perspective, it's for them to be paying taxes in the US. And I think this is where I get the instinctive view of, well, companies should be paying more taxes. That's the moral choice. But it's not necessarily that simple, in the sense that if paying taxes in one country is going to effectively deprive another country of what they believe to be their rightful tax take, we have a problem. And that's why I think it brings us all the way back always to saying we need the international agreements. So a company saying, I am now, I feel pressured in Europe, and so the moral thing now for me to do is to start paying much more tax in Europe. They may then be sending less profit back to the US. And the US is going to say, whoa, hang on a minute. That may have felt like the right thing to do for Europe, but it's not the right thing to do for the US because we're now losing tax take. And so at the heart of the Biden proposals, where I think they're really interesting, in a sense, is as a message to say, hey, international community, can we all come up with corporate tax rates that are very similar to each other? Can we get them in the same zone? And I think the motivation is a very simple one, which is that the Biden administration plans to take the levels of corporate income tax in the US back to something, not all the way back to where they were, but closer to where they were. And in doing so, they're obviously worried that this will then re-incentivize companies to move taxes to other jurisdictions, or not to bring the profits back to the United States. And so what you want is some kind of international agreement. And I think that's where you sort of end up. I think the legal and the moral choices align. If you get to a place, for example, if everyone had a 25% corporate tax rate, then a company could sit back and say, I don't care. You guys just work it out. If you want me to pay 100% of my tax in the US, I'll do that. If you want me to pay 20% in the US and 80% in Europe, I'll do that. It really doesn't matter, because I'm going to pay 25% of my profit wherever it is. And so, in a sense, I say that equalization, or that reduction of the incentives to move things around, I think is extraordinarily helpful, and would help the moral and legal choices align with each other.
Before we leave the moral point, and I want us to get to what you've been describing here, which is the question of tax competition, if tax competition should exist or not. Before we leave the moral choice, though, I mean, I remember a lot of times when I discussed this with people, and they essentially ended up saying, well, why don't you just pay a sort of gratuitous amount of tax, add 5% on whatever you think you owed, and then pay that in, and make sure that sort of shows that you're morally inclined to try to pay your fair share. And I originally thought it was a good idea because, well, partly being Swedish, I think that, that's how tax systems work. But then something really interesting was pointed out to me, and that is not often considered. And that is that if you were to do that, you would, with an almost 100% probability, end up with a shareholder lawsuit in the United States, because you were paying more tax than was legally required of you, which meant that you were spending the shareholders' money in a way that it was not legally defensible, and essentially stealing from them. So you have a really interesting moral issue here, where we have sort of been talking about morals as how much should I pay, but when we talk about who is actually paying, It's this company, but the company in turn is owned by its shareholders. And those shareholders today include pension funds and lots of private individuals, etc. So how do you square that moral dimension with the question of how much tax you pay?
Yeah, I mean, and again, I'm with you on this idea of voluntary contribution. Though at one stage, when the debate got very heated in the UK, I think it was Starbucks actually, sort of as part of their defensive strategy, said yes, and we're going to make a contribution to the UK taxpayer. We don't think we need to legally, but we're going to do it out of the goodness of our hearts. And there was a terrible backlash to say, hey, hang on, taxes are not voluntary. Tax is something you have to do. Because I just don't think it's a long-term solution to sort of end up with this mix and match scheme. And again, on the moral point, if we think of our personal taxation situation, a lot of these same principles apply there. So I say, if you were offered the choice, having earned some money overseas, quite legally and legitimately, as long as you keep it in your overseas bank account, you don't have to pay tax on it back at home. For you to take that choice, is that how unethical, how immoral is it for you to take that choice if it's a part of the package and the deal for you taking that employment overseas? I think some things are unethical. Actually, I'm really curious about one aspect of US tax law, which is the fact that essentially you lose your citizenship if you stop paying taxes in the US, which I find curious as a Brit. I mean, British billionaires do not live in Britain. They all go abroad. They all make their money here and they all move to Monaco or wherever it is. And they carry on being British. And as long as they stay out of the country for half of the year, it's fine. And those I find really, sort of curious choices where you're, moving out. But I say, as long as people are paying what they're due to pay, and all of these American billionaires, the Jeff Bezoses and Mark Zuckerbergs and people, say if they were British, they wouldn't live in Britain anymore. They would have gone. But they all do live in America and they pay their taxes and they pay the amount that they're due to pay under the tax code, and their businesses similarly pay the amount they're due to pay under the tax code. And I do question, why we would be arguing for people going outside of the tax code and making voluntary contributions. Where you might look at the ethics of a business is to say, look, are they trying to sort out these anomalies and make sure that there is a fair structure? So for example, the test might be, do they support publicly and vocally the kind of process that's taking place in the OECD to try and come up with a new international framework? Are they trying to get rid of anomalies that are potentially unfairly beneficial to them? That is an ethical stance. But are they paying, extra money that they're not due to pay? That starts to look a bit like, a PR exercise, which I say it was when this happened in the UK. It turned out that people treated it as a PR exercise rather than a serious attempt at tax fairness.
Yes, and at that point, you're actually paying with someone else's money. A corporation's money is held by its shareholders ultimately, and those shareholders are then not necessarily going to see the wisdom of contributing their funds in a way that goes above and beyond what's legally required. But I think there is an interesting question about that. And I think another thing that we should just, and this is, people are going to be very skeptical about this and they're going to be very cynical about it, but I think it's true to say that if the tax system was clear cut and you could get an easy answer to what your fair share was, and it was non-discriminatory and it didn't tax you twice, and it didn't discriminate against industries or against nationalities, then I think almost every single tech company would throw their hands up and say, thank God. Yeah. That's really good. We would love to have a predictable system that fulfills those simple requirements. And if that means we pay more tax, 5% up, I think that most tech companies would actually think that was a cheap price to pay, not to get embroiled in these moral discussions about paying your fair share or not. Now, I know a lot of people will be skeptical about this, but don't you? I mean, from my perspective, I think that's absolutely true.
It was all downside, all pain, and I have to say all the way through, the company. And again, careful to say this, but tech companies are in this particular position where when they're in their growth phase, they're spending other people's money. So they're not necessarily too obsessed with that. And then if they are successful, they're often highly profitable, and so they can afford, in a sense, to pay the taxes. What they want is that clarity. And again, to get really concrete, if there was a system that said, you build a digital advertising service out of the US, you make X amount of profit, 50% of the profit gets to be taxed by the US government, or whatever the prevailing rate is. 20% of the profit, gets to be taxed by whoever does the sort of distribution mechanism. 30% gets taxed in the end consumer's country. Whatever it is, it kind of almost doesn't matter how you want to divide it up, but just come up with a number and explain how to divide it up, and then company can get on and organize to pay its taxes according to that formula. The problem we have at the moment is everybody has a different formula. I would say, in the sense, and everybody has a different interest. So that this is why it's a hard negotiation. If in that model of a US tech company, the US's interest, frankly, is in having 100% of the profit booked to the US. The interest of a country like France would be in having 100% of the profit booked to France. But France and the US and UK and the US need to get together and say, okay, this is how we're going to divide the profit up for tax purposes between us. And the numbers they come up with should add up to 100, not 150 or 200, but 100% at the end of that calculation. And that's what hasn't happened, but potentially may now happen with the conversations that are going to happen through the OECD, and particularly with this new US administration saying they're very open to this discussion.
You started to hit on this in the beginning when we talked about France and the UK and you making your widget, etc. You said you would then look at marketing and see how much marketing added value to the profit that was being taxed. The mechanism whereby which we do this is sometimes referred to as transfer pricing. And explain a little bit to us about how transfer pricing works today and why it's completely different from what you just described, where the countries essentially would make up the transfer pricing mechanism and the portions that would be attributable to every single market.
So this is where, again, if people read about there being tax raids on companies and court cases going on, it's often around this area that there is today a set of conventions agreed amongst tax professionals in particular, that try and value the different elements of that. So yes, I've made my widget. They will try and value how much should accrue to the manufacturer of the widget, how much should accrue to the local sales and promotion activities. And they do that by comparison with other businesses in the sector. And they've come up with formula. And the formula might say, for example, we think that the marketing of a particular kind of product adds 5 or represents 5% of the eventual sale value. And so a company will say, okay, in that case, when I calculate the profit for my local company, it's going to be 5% of everything that was sold. Now, the company's overall profit margin on that product might be 40%. And so you can see the gap there. If that's the case, then only 5% of the value of the products being sold is under these rules, these conventions available for taxation, whereas the rest is all going back to the headquarters company. That may feel unfair to the local country. And so the country that's only getting 5% says, no. I actually think, the value add of all of the marketing and the stuff you do here is 15%. I'd like 15% of the profit of the revenue rather than 5% to stay in the country. And this is the stuff of argumentation between tax professionals and finance ministries, again, to see if they can reach some kind of agreement to say, look, is it 5%? Is it 10%? Do they split the difference? Agree at 7.5%. So they have these conversations going on all the time. And the idea is ultimately to be fair to both countries. You can't just have the country that wants the high, local percentage setting the rules, because that's unfair to the headquarters country. Equally, as I say, the headquarters country is incentivized to keep that number down as low as possible. But what you're trying to do, and what tax professionals try and do, is reach an objective standard to say, like, for each kind of activity, this is how much value add there is, and therefore this is how much of the revenue and profit should be booked in a particular country.
And to be absolutely clear, that work today is done internally by the companies themselves. They don't have, well, they have an external yardstick in the sense that there are conventions and standards and there are ways and mechanisms to calculate this, but the guidance is not strict. It doesn't give you the percentages. It doesn't even give you the ballpark percentages, but it's something that companies are forced to do themselves today, right?
Yeah, you're right. And again, it isn't as simplifying it, but I think not excessively to say that often they say the dispute is a tax authority will come and say, it's almost literally that 15%, company says 5, they negotiate till they get to 10. So it's almost like a business negotiation where you're in an area that isn't very clearly defined. In some areas it is. And again, we should be really clear, this is not confined to tech companies. This is all kinds of businesses have had to do this for years, and so it'd be the same if you manufactured like pharmaceuticals, and you've got to work out how much of the value
or luxury goods or anything else. Right?
Yeah. How much was the trademark of a luxury good worth? Because there's going to be a license fee that the luxury goods company charges, and it's going to take money back for this license fee and take that out of the value of the goods locally. Car manufacturer, whatever you're making that involves some sort of clever stuff at the center, there's going to be some kind of fee, often set up through some kind of licensing company, typically optimized for tax, and that fee again could be challenged by a tax authority. They can say, look, you're just taking too much out. We want you to leave more back in the country, for us to tax, because you essentially, by taking that fee out, you reduce the amount of profit that's being made locally. So all of this stuff, as I say, is a classic area of negotiation that takes place between tax authorities and businesses in all sectors, with the ultimate goal being to try and be fair to both importing and exporting countries, so they each get a fair slice of the taxable profits at the end of the day.
And now let's get back to tax competition, because the great big question then, of course, becomes, if you are able to create value in one country, say the US, and then you go to another region, say Europe, you can pick and choose between all of the different European member states, and you can argue that you're going to headquarter there, which means that when you start making this calculation, this transfer pricing calculation, a lot more value will be accrued in the new country of establishment, where you're saying, this is where my European base is, or your Asian base, or whatever it may be. So that means that we end up in this problem where, if there are different tax rates, a rational actor would probably say, well, I'm going to try to make sure to apportion the most value I can to a tax regime that I think seems reasonable. And if there are different tax rates, what you get is something called tax competitions. States compete on the tax rates that they offer. And not only on the tax rates, and this is important, because almost all states have some kind of incentive program where they say that if you come to us, we will give you a tax break for all of the investments you make, or we will give you a specific tax program that can work for a couple of years, according to which you will be taxed in a perhaps less intrusive way for 3 or 5 years when you establish your company, because they want to attract the foreign direct investment. So you have tax competition through tax rates and through tax incentives. So on the other side of this debate, where we started out with all of the countries saying, oh, the companies aren't paying their fair share. The other side of this debate, we have all of the countries competing to attract those same companies, and do so with lower tax rates and tax incentives. How does this fit together?
I mean, the EU is such a sort of instructive example, because when you think about it, if somebody is coming from outside of the EU and selling into the EU single market, you're right, they'll establish in one country, but they're basically selling the same product to everybody in the EU, and EU member states may have different local tax rates, but in theory, whatever tax is being raised should be divided up pretty much equally across the EU. It should be allocated to each country, and instead it tends to be allocated to one headquarters country at the moment. You're right, and that incentivizes tax competition, and there's a long-standing debate around Ireland in particular. Some other countries like the Netherlands come into it, but Ireland is seen as a country that benefits from that tax competition and sustains a low tax rate. But in theory, whether or not you're established in Ireland, the rational thing for the EU is you look at how much profit a company makes in the EU as a whole, and then you divide that up to be taxed by each EU member state. And there has been a long-standing discussion within the EU about doing precisely this. But what's really
common
interesting,
consolidated corporate tax base.
But they failed to agree it, and that actually.
And why is that? Why is that? Well, why do they fail?
Again, I mean, there's winners and losers. There's always going to be winners and losers in any kind of tax regime, and people are comfortable with the status quo. And so you imagine common corporate tax base would say, look, some countries, I guess, that are sort of large importers of goods and services from other countries may end up winning. Because they're not getting the corporate tax revenue. The companies are not based in their country, but now they're going to get the tax revenue because they're large consumers of those products. And then countries that are large exporters, Ireland would be the example at the moment, are going to end up losing. And so people they don't like the sudden change. They're okay with incremental change, but not sudden change. I think that's what's been holding them back. But we should talk to some EU politicians about that. But
we should. But there's another aspect here that I've heard in the debates, and it might be a Scandinavian peculiarity, and that is that the European Union actually doesn't really have that broad of a tax mandate.
No, that's right.
And guaranteeing it the ability to do what you're describing would essentially be, at least in a sort of a simplified way, federalization of the European tax system. And I think that there is a lot of people who also feel reluctant to take that step. And that doesn't have to be winners or losers. It's about handing over competence to the European level, where you're worried that might in some way impinge on your ability to tax going forward. Many Scandinavian countries, for example, might worry that they would have to tax less.
Yes.
and not be able to keep up their welfare states at the level that they currently have them. Whereas many other countries might worry that they would have to tax more. But that sort of transference of competence seems to be at least a small part, I think, of the debate.
I think you're right. The competence isn't there, but I guess I was sort of curious as to why EU member states who frequently complain about international tax structures are not willing to take that step, even within such tight a club as the EU. And I've seen that as sort of quite a negative indicator for the success of OECD. I think, again, until these recent moves by the United States, because if even a club like the EU can't come to common arrangements for essentially sharing out corporate tax revenue, which is what all these proposals are about, it didn't bode well for a broader international community being able to do that.
And they've been around for decades, these proposals. Yeah. This is not something that came up with the tech industry even. It's been around for decades as the European Union has realized that the international taxation needs to be reformed. But consistently, as you say, not achieved full success.
Yeah. And then I think the really interesting formula, and this is the bit we've got to look for. So if we look at the Biden proposals, part of it is saying let's all get a level playing field, or get our corporate tax rates similar so that we take away the incentives for this profit shifting sort of idea or these sort of international structures. Makes perfect sense. But the second part that needs to be addressed, which I think is in many senses going to be harder, it is this question of profit allocation. And crucially, the Biden proposals are about making sure there's sufficient revenue to deal with the COVID fallout for the United States government. So this sort of equalization they see as a revenue gainer. But is the United States going to be willing to agree to formulae that mean that more of the profits of the Googles and Facebooks of this world will end up being taxed in other countries? And if so, what are they going to ask in return from other countries? Are they going to want to tax more of the profits of companies that sell into the US? And that's where we'll get to the really crunchy stuff in this debate. Any new formulae. So it's one thing to say we agree in principle that the economic activity should be taxed in more countries. It's quite another to end up signing on the dotted line and saying, okay, the new formula is France gets 3% of Google's profits, or gets to be able to tax 3% of Google's profits. The United States will only tax 50%. The UK will get 6%, and so on. And that, again, interesting to see whether the United States really is committed to that. But that is the long-term sort of solution that would get us to the place we talked about earlier, where the companies are no longer in the firing line. We actually now have an international structure. And if you think you're getting too small a share, the answer is to go back and literally renegotiate how those shares are divided up between the different countries with other governments, not with the companies.
Before we get our listeners too excited for the solution, we should mention that it's a part of a long-running discussion within the G20 and the OECD that was based on what was once referred to as the BEPS project, the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting project. And it's not as if this is the first time it's being discussed either, but there are a couple of decades of discussions here that seem to be coming to an head. And I think you're right, Richard. I mean, it's really interesting to see how the Biden administration is approaching this. And if I was a betting man, I'd say, you have a 3, 4, 5% increase in the probability that something will happen. But it's not more. It's not a 50% increase that we'll get a global taxation solution. It's less than that. And the glaring problem, or I think challenge, is that the OECD and the G20 doesn't represent all markets. So you have some pretty big markets out there that are not necessarily going to be included in this. And if you want to have a real international agreement, you probably need to have an international treaty organization and a solution that's much broader than what can currently be accommodated within the discussions that we are seeing on the tax arena. That said, though, I do believe that these are exciting times,
yes.
and certainly something that is worthwhile following. And I think that all of our former colleagues are probably very much leaning forward and reading up on everything that's coming out of the Biden administration right now. Is there something else? When we wrap this up, we started out talking about why tax is important, how it's the fair share notion, the notion of morals, the notion of contributing back to the society that enable you to profit from your economic activity. Is there something, how would you like to sort of wrap this up, to think about the long-term future?
So I think long-term, really we should be focused on I think getting these, or having a common agreement around what fairness looks like. And I think we should get that debate out. So whether or not we end up with government signing on the dotted line, I think you're right, is a big question mark, because signing on the dotted line may mean giving stuff up and being unpopular, and governments don't like that. But I think if we can even develop a sort of common language to say, when you create a tech product, we all understand that this is the kind of amount of value that should be associated with the software engineering and the creation. This is the kind of amount of value that should be associated with the marketing and sales. This is the sort of amount that should be associated with the data, which is the other element we haven't discussed but often comes up, like what value is in the data. I just think if we could have that shared understanding, then we would know what we think fair looks like as commentators in this space, or as people working in this space, because people in companies, and you must have experienced this, often feel very uncomfortable. They're asking the question: are we the baddies? Are we doing this wrong?
Seeking clarity more than anything.
Yeah.
I think the frustration repeatedly expressed, and I think even written in an op-ed in 2013 by Eric Schmidt, was that give us the rules, give us the clarity, give us the sort of percentages, and we'll pay them, as long as they're not discriminatory, doesn't tax us twice, and doesn't sort of take any industry and extract value from that industry punitively. Then we're good.
Yeah. But it's still,
you're right.
It's still very opaque. To borrow from another area, we really need taxation algorithmic transparency. We need to know how we just had this discussion today about transfer pricing and these negotiations. I bet most of the people who sort of out there who follow the news and tech companies have very little insight into those kind of conversations, what's happening. So,
and this I think is the other long-term thing that's really important that you're putting your finger on now is that as we increase the digitization of tax and revenue services, increases, as we increase the digitization of the economy, more and more of this stuff will logistically be accessible and transparent in a very different way than it's been historically. I mean, one of the great improvements in many taxation systems is actually just by using technology for compliance and making sure that it's really easy to comply with the taxes that exist. And that might reduce your losses and increase your tax revenues quite massively in some economies. Currently in Sweden, and my American colleagues tend to shudder when they hear this, we do our taxes with an SMS. We get from the state, here's what you're supposed to pay. We've listed all of your income. We know exactly which accounts you have because there's full transparency between the banks and the revenue service. Here's what you end up doing. Do you agree? SMS yes to this number, and then you did your taxes. That's it. That's essentially it. That should be the long-term endpoint of a lot more taxation than what happens today. So maybe the problem doesn't go away through international treaties as much as through an improved logistics, where the actual revenue streams and the economy becomes more transparent and more taxable as it moves into the digital space.
Certainly. I think that I like that. I'm about to, after this podcast, go and start working on my tax return because, of course, the British tax year peculiarly finishes on the 5th of April, not on any particular fixed date in the year. It's not a calendar year. It's just a magic number. I wish I could do them with a simple SMS.
That's good. Well, on that note, until the rest of the world can do their taxes with SMSs, and I really feel the local patriotism is strong. We would welcome, as always, your thoughts, your ideas, your comments on this episode. And this was one of our subject-oriented episodes. We'll soon get back to some of them that are oriented towards craft. And if you want to prepare already for next week's episode, what you can do is that you can pick up, and I think there are open source or Creative Commons versions of this, you can pick up Lawrence Lessig's Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace. We will reread this classic of tech policy, and we will discuss it next week in our upcoming session for the podcast, the name of which is
Regulate.tech.
Exactly. Thank you so much for listening, and have a great week.